Right. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our event today, which is the craft of collaborative world with Cheryl Ntumy, who has written a beautiful novella, Songs for the Shadows. We welcome everyone today, and we hope you're gonna enjoy this conversation between Cheryl and I. Cheryl, hi, how are you?
Hi, Tlotlo. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Congratulations on the release of your novella, which I loved. I'm always blown away by your writing, as everyone knows. Right. So today's event, we're going to do a Q&A discussion, which will be followed by two readings from Cheryl, and we'll also open up to questions from the audience. Right. So I will start with a bio. Cheryl Ntumy is a Ghanaian writer who dabbles in everything from speculative fiction to romance, with several novels out. She is a member of the Sauti Collective, a group of African writers who have created a shared world, a shared Afrocentric speculative fiction universe where other writers and creators can play. The first Sauti-verse anthology, Mother Sound, edited by Wale Talabi, is out now, published by Android Press. Cheryl's featured story, The Way of Bach, was among the works nominated for a British Science Fiction Association Award 2024. And I am Tlotlo Tsamaase, who will be moderating this and asking Cheryl all the intriguing questions about her novella. I am an author of short stories that have been published in several literary magazines, and my book, Room City, was out just this year. Right. So for those who don't know, I've known Cheryl for, I think it's over 10 years, right? And yeah, I believe the first writing that I came to read of yours was The Crossing, which was a short novella. And I remember at that time I was completely blown away by it. It was also around the time when I was also like reading Helen Oyeyemi's books. And so when I read that, it reminded me so much of Helen Oyeyemi's writing. And from there on, I've seen you write romance stories. I believe you used to write like slim romance novels, which were published in South Africa. You wrote, was it a YA trilogy? It was set in Botswana, which I loved, and you've also written fantasy. Just the way that you're able to write different genres, I find that very fascinating. And the way you're so prolific, you're fast writing, you write it with like such great quality and intelligence. Right. So the world building for Songs for the Shadows was beautiful. It's very slim, but it felt like I was reading like a novel. And I remember when I was talking to Emily, your publisher, I told her that reminded me of Rebecca Ronha's Black Sun and Albin and that's the Four Profound Waves. So, right, we can get into it. Can you like give us a description of Songs for the Shadow, and just your journey in writing it?
Yes, well, thank you. That's really high praise, first of all. I really appreciate that for the lovely words that you said. It's really an honor to have you say that um, because you're a writer that I really respect and admire. So your opinion counts for a lot. So thank you very much. Um, yeah, I can give a little bit of I guess, a brief description, spoiler free, about the story. Essentially, it's a story about grief, it's about redemption, um, and it's about, I guess, the struggle to find peace. Um, it's set in the Sautiverse, like you mentioned, and I can talk a bit more about that later, explain really what that is. But it's about a woman who excavates sound for a living. Essentially, she's like an archaeologist, but for ancient sounds rather than ancient physical artifacts. And she's a bit of a risk taker. She's kind of running away from a really traumatic event that happened in her past, and so she uses her work as a way to escape from the pain and the trauma of what happened to her. And she does this really by misusing sounds and misusing sound magic and stealing pieces, sort of fragments from the artifacts, the sound artifacts that she's meant to be excavating as part of her job, and then using them to kind of dispel the demons that have been following her around since her childhood, since this tragedy took place. And the story is about what happens when one of her jobs goes terribly, terribly wrong, and she finds herself trapped outside of time and now has to contend with all the things that she's been running away from.
Wow.
Yeah,
Gosh.
that's my overview.
That is like the best description ever. I love the phrase like an archaeology of sounds, which is exactly what it is. So before we actually get quite deep into the world of this novella, can you give us a background of your literary journey, where it started, and how we got here today? Because you've been on this journey, like, um,
Yeah. Gosh, where did it begin? I mean, it's kind of hard for me to say where exactly it began because I feel like I've been writing for my whole life. I knew pretty much from the beginning that this was what I wanted to do. And so I took it very seriously from very early on, in the sense that I was always scribbling little stories in my school books, and both my parents are teachers, so we had a lot of stationery in the house. So, exercise books and pens and things. And so I would always just be writing a story. I was constantly writing a story. And I knew that it was something that I really wanted to pursue, and I wanted to be good at it. And my aim was, in the back of my mind, I just always thought, I want to be able to write anything, any kind of story. I want to be able to write a screenplay, a novel, a short story, a poem, a play. So I would just try different things, I would like write my own comic books, I would write my own magazines, I would just write and write and write and write constantly. Yeah, and I would get involved in things like, school magazines and that kind of thing. So by the time I was like, I think I was 16 when I first submitted something to a publisher. It was a novel that I had written. It was not very good, so of course it got rejected. Um, but at that point, I felt like that was a very big milestone for me. That was the beginning of my official writing journey because it was the point where I had actually tried to get something out there. It wasn't just stuff that was going to be read by myself and my friends and my family. Yeah, so ever since then, I took it really, really seriously. And in 2010, no, wait, I think it was 2009, maybe. Hang on, it might have been earlier than that. I can't remember exactly when it was that my first short story got published, but I entered a competition, a writing competition in Botswana. It was hosted by the British Council, and I submitted a short story called White, and yeah, and the story got first place in the competition, and that was when I started to think, oh, okay, maybe short stories are also something that I can pursue, because mainly I'd been focused on novels. I've always been more of a novel writer. Yeah, but that was the beginning of realizing, oh, you can actually sell a piece of work that is not a novel. So there are so many options, and I think that really opened my mind to the different ways in which I could make a writing career work. Yeah, and since then, I think shortly after that, a few years after that, I published my first novella, which is Crossing, the one that you mentioned. That was also published through a competition. And the same year, I published my first romance novel with Sapphire Press in South Africa. Sadly, they don't exist anymore, but that was a really great experience. They were lovely to work with, and I think we did 5 romance novels together.
Wow.
Yeah, so those were the first books of mine that got published before the fantasy and YA and other things. Yeah.
And I guess the follow-up question is, because you mentioned that romance was like the first genre before your gateway into SF, science fiction and fantasy. So what drew you to that genre? Was it easy? Was it difficult?
Actually, I'd always really been interested in SFF. And I'd always been writing in SFF. Even that first story that I submitted at 16, it was fantasy. So that was always what inspired me most. I enjoyed reading romance, but I had never really thought about writing romance. It just happened that at that particular point in time, there was this new romance imprint and they were looking for writers. And so a fellow writer in Botswana, Lori Kuizile, she's the one who actually recommended me because she had written romance before and she knew me, she knew my work. And I think when they asked her, do you know anybody else who could potentially do this? She gave them my name. And that's how I got into it. So I wasn't really looking to get into romance. It just kind of happened. And I thought, oh, this is a fun opportunity. I like reading romance, so I'm sure I can try my hand at writing it. And yeah, the rest is history, basically. And so coming back to SFF was not really a challenge for me. It was just kind of going back to what I was used to and what I was passionate about in the first place.
I mean, it goes to show how versatile you are because if I try to write a romance book, I know someone's gonna end up dead. It won't be a romance book anymore, you know.
It could be a dark romance.
Sorry,
Yeah, it could be a dark romance.
I
That's a
guess.
possibility.
So because you're talking about your experience as a writer, and just your journey, I'm curious to hear you speak on to how it has been like to cultivate like your career as an African writer. I mean, I know during that time you were working and living in Botswana, you were publishing some work in South Africa, you published some work in the US. So what kind of things did you have to contend with? That can, and what other things did you do that can, I don't know, I guess inspire other writers who are trying to get into the publishing industry that's in the US or South African or UK?
Mm. To be honest, I didn't really have a plan. Um, I think for a very long time I was not strategic as a writer because it was always a passion thing for me. And so my focus was always on the craft rather than anything else.
Mm.
And a lot of the opportunities that came my way came, I mean, I would say almost by luck or through, meeting the right person at the right time or a writer that I've worked with before, um, sharing something with me or recommending something. Um, so it took a while before I got to the point where I started to think, okay, I should actually start doing some research into how the publishing industry works, what kind of publishers are out there where I can submit my work outside of just the usual suspects, that I had been thinking of the big five essentially, which at the
Mm.
time more than five.
Yeah.
But yeah, just thinking outside of the box and really trying to understand what would work. It took me a long time to get there, to get to that stage. So I spent a lot of time just working on the craft and doing writing workshops, sharing my work with other writers. We would read each other's work. We did a lot of that with Tlotlo,
Yeah.
this literary organization in Botswana, where we would meet every Sunday. We would share each other's stories, read each other's work, workshop stories together. And I think that was a really, really important foundation for me, because by the time I got to the stage of thinking about things like, okay, how do I get an agent? How do you write a pitch? How do you write a synopsis? By the time I got to that stage, I feel like I was confident enough in my writing, because I had spent so much time on the craft. And so, yeah, I didn't have to try to juggle both. I think what happens with a lot of new writers is that they're trying to do both at the same time. You're trying to develop your skills and your ability as a writer, your confidence. You're trying to kind of find your voice while also trying to sell your work. And it's tough. It's hard to do one of those things, but to do both. And if you also have, a 9 to 5 gig on top of all that, I think it can be quite intimidating and quite a lot to balance. So yeah, my advice is to, as much as possible, take any opportunity you can to develop your craft, and also talk to other writers, make friends with other writers. If there are writing groups or associations that you can join, do that, because you learn so much from other people. I mean, I learned a lot from research, doing my own online research and things like that. But I mean, that's nothing compared to what I learned from just talking to other writers and sharing experiences. And, someone else telling me, oh, you know what? When I was trying to get published, this is what I did. And this is what worked. This is what didn't work. Yeah, so definitely seek out writing groups, communities. That's where you'll really get the most sound advice. A lot of the advice that's out there, it might not be, it's not universal, let me put it that way, especially for writers on the African continent. It's not always helpful to try to follow, I don't know, whatever Stephen King does, or you know what I mean? It's great for Stephen King, but that might not work for you, sitting in Accra or sitting in Francistown and Botswana. You know what I mean? It's not going to have the same impact. You're not going to have the same opportunities. Even basic things like back in the days when we were submitting things through the mail, regular post, and you had to send a stamp self-addressed envelope. That was a challenge, because you're sending something. It's not like you're sending something from one part of the US to another part of the US. You're sending something to the US from the other side of the world. First of all, that costs a lot of money. You're sending a manuscript that's probably heavy. Figuring out how the stamp self-addressed thing works when you're sending stuff internationally. So a lot of the rules that seem to apply don't necessarily apply to everybody. And I think that's why it really helps to find other writers and find communities close to you, people that are in your area or your region at least. Yeah, and their experiences can also be really eye-opening and helpful in helping you figure out what path to take. So that was definitely the case for me. That was a very long answer, sorry.
No, it's okay. It's very helpful. I mean, I was even putting down notes because I had like so many questions. Speaking of like literary communities, you are one of the founders of Saltiverse, which is a universe created by African and African diaspora writers, and which is the world that Songs for the Shadows is set in. And I know that they released an anthology, Mother Sound, last year. So can you give us a brief intro into Saltiverse? And I think after your description, we can go into a reading, and then we'll have a little bit more questions regarding how you wrote this novella to a world that was created by other writers. But can you just give us an intro to Saltiverse?
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Saltiverse is it's a really wonderful thing. I'm biased, of course, but I think it really is a wonderful thing. Essentially, it is a shared universe for speculative fiction, um, created by a group of African writers, like you said. And one of the things that makes it so special and unique is that it's an Afrocentric universe, and we were very intentional about making it, about steeping it in genuine African culture. So rather than having things that were completely made up, we try to draw as much as possible from our own cultures. And we all come from different countries, different parts of the continent. So we would have, there's bits of languages from different places, cultural norms from different places, um, you know, things like customs from one country that we would then sort of extrapolate to the entire universe that we're creating. And so we really wanted it to feel authentic in the sense that people from the continent would be able to look at it or look at the story set in this world and feel like, oh, this is familiar to me. This is not something outlandish, even though it's set in space, but it feels really rooted. So that was an important thing for us as we were creating it. And it's a universe of 5 planets, and it spans millions of years. So it's a pretty big playground to play in, because you can set a story on any of the planets or on a space station, in between the planets. You can set it at any point in the history of the Saltiverse, and we have developed a story Bible that kind of guides anyone who's interested in contributing to the universe in terms of social dynamics, how the communities work. We really wanted it to be to lean matriarchal. So we have, a lot of elderly female characters that are respected or that are in power. We also wanted to have a more communal governing system. So rather than having, a president, for instance, we would have a council of elders. So we really wanted it to feel like how our cultures are, traditionally speaking. And we also wanted it to be inclusive. So we have representation of different genders, different sexualities, different abilities. And yeah, those were things that were quite important to us. But the main thing about it that is really, really significant is that it centers on sound. So sound is kind of the primary resource. Sound is what powers technology, it's what powers magic. And because sound is such a focus in this universe, there's no written language. They only have an oral language. So, that really, it was a really interesting process, just kind of figuring out what that would look like in practice. Because we're also used to having, especially, we're writers, we're so used to having written language. But trying to imagine a world in which that's not the way that people operate. Instead, everything is oral. So what does that mean for contracts? What does that mean for libraries and education? What is a school like in a place where there are no books, where there is no alphabet? How do people communicate? How do they send messages? So all those things were really interesting to explore. And yeah, and because it's very steeped in African norms, it's kind of this world where science and technology coexist, not just coexist, but are almost two sides of the same coin, I guess. So it's not a world in which there is science and no magic, or a world in which there is magic and no science. It's a world in which there is both. And that's perfectly normal. Nobody finds any of that strange, because that tends to be the case in a lot of African countries as well. I hope that gives an overview.
It really does. Like, it sounds very amazing, to be honest, the work that you guys are doing, and just the the process and building this universe, and how anyone can just fit their story in, you know. I really, really love it. Right, so can we have your first reading?
Yes, absolutely. Let me just hold up the book for a minute. So this is the book I'm reading from, Songs for the Shadows. And let me just quickly say that this cover was illustrated by Akintoba Kalejaye. I'm probably mispronouncing your name. I'm so sorry, Toba. He did the illustration. He does a lot of the illustrations for Sauti projects, the Story Bible as well. And then the design, including this typography, was done by Stephen Embleton. So yeah, those are both members of the Sautiverse family. And I'm really excited and honored to have them working on my cover. So yeah, if you're looking for great art, you know where to go. All right.
And Stephen just said hi from the chat. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you. All right. I'm reading from sort of the middle of the first chapter. Okay. Shaddari made her way from the bridge to the cargo bay of the Nusetor. Mamino's power still pulsed inside her, making her body thrum with pain. She had not slept here on the ship, as was typical after a visit to the Urogi. Instead, she had slept on the other side of the city, in her now grounded shack, among the detritus of the Sierra. Never a good idea, even less so when she had a job in the morning, but traces of her former lover still lingered on the ship, and Shaddari hadn't gone through all the bother of quieting one set of ghosts only to contend with another. She made a mental note to dispose of the rest of Esise's belongings at the earliest opportunity. The door opened at the sound of her voice, sliding back to admit her into the cargo bay. Inside stood a tank filled with water from the Zizafeni Sea, pitch black in the dimly lit space. The only sign of the 7 creatures within came from the occasional pulses of light they emitted through their tentacles. The Mahu Mahadi had no equivalent for human conventions such as greeting and inquiring after the health of others, so Shaddari didn't bother. "I'm sorry for the delay," she said. "We'll be taking off any moment from now." Their reply came in vibrations rippling through the water. They spoke the way they did everything else, as a collective consciousness. It had taken Shaddari months to learn to decipher the vibrations, and several more to accept that they lacked the nuances of humanoid language. No poetry, no metaphor. Time is of no consequence, they said. Like some ethereal cousin of Orinorin's swirling fog, the Mahu Mahadi's bodies were grey-blue clouds atop hundreds of tentacles. In the water they looked like tendrils of smoke curling around an electric current. The excavation site for today's dig is a lake in a sisum, a place dotted with small pockets of silence, Shaddari told them. None of us know the place, but we're told it will be challenging. We'll set up in the sound patches and try not to move. It should be easier for you. The bosses believe that none of the silences extend below the surface of the water. Have any of you worked in a sisum before? Those here have not, but we know how to navigate the silences. Good, then we should be fine. Shaddari didn't approach the tank. Something about the creatures always made her nervous, as though they could see her in ways her own species couldn't. Her fingers slid into the left pocket of her worksuit, where she had put the drums containing the leftovers of the stolen sounds she had used the night before. What would happen if she released them into the tank? Would the world end? Would the Mahu Mahadi even notice? Silencing the wicked voice prompting her to take the risk, she asked, "Is it true that you can see the future?" "The future doesn't exist." She refrained from rolling her eyes. Possible futures, then. How the dig might go, or where I might be a juzu from now. Whether the ghost echoes would ever leave her for good. Your fate is of no consequence. It's of great consequence to me. They said nothing, floating there in superior silence. She couldn't tell whether they had no answer or had simply grown bored with the conversation. "Do you know anything about ghost echoes?" Her tongue stretched out to moisten suddenly dry lips. "I mean the echoes of the departed. Echoes that linger." "What is gone is gone. What remains, remains." "That's not helpful." They fell silent again, staring into smoke and crackling electricity, felt distinctly one-sided, even as she sensed them probing her with their otherness. Yet, she thought, if they had eyes, she might feel less at sea. "Let me put it this way," she said. "I know you have no interest in human notions of the divine, but you can perceive things of the spirit, can't you? Things that transcend time and space?" There was a pause before they responded. "If one pays enough attention, one perceives all." Shantari stepped back with a weary sigh. Why did she keep trying? These beings had no interest in connecting with humans. "Must be liberating to care for nothing but your sacred sea," she murmured. "How I envy you." "Your feelings are of no consequence, I know." She left the cargo bay, dissatisfaction heavy in her gut. The Mahu Mahadi had no propensity for guile. Even though she knew their worldview differed from hers, she couldn't shake the conviction that they were right. Not just factually, but on some deeper cosmic level. If they said her fate didn't matter, it didn't matter. Her fingers caressed the drums in her pocket, seeking an elusive solace. I think I'll stop there for that one.
Oh, wow. I was completely taken away by that. Just brought me back to the world again. That was very beautiful. So I'm curious in terms of writing this novella, given that it's set in the Southwest, I started thinking about how authors write for hire and how sometimes editors can be hands-on, or the authors are given free rein to just create the world that they want to. So when you're writing to this world, what is the writing process like? Like the advantages, the difficulties? Are there some places where you can't stray too far from? How much freedom do you have?
I think you have quite a lot of freedom. The interesting thing about it is that I think it seems more restrictive than it actually is.
Mm,
I think when you approach it, it seems like, okay, well, there's going to be a lot of rules that I have to follow. But really, it's not about um, fitting into the world. It's more a process of, okay, letting the world inspire you, I guess I would say. I think that's what makes the process work best, is
mm,
if you read through the what's already existing out there, the stories that are published, the story Bible, look at the images, and let them evoke whatever they evoke, whatever comes up, and then go, oh, okay, that sounds like something that I'd really like to explore, and then um, pitch it to the collective. So that's really how we work. We come up with an idea, um, pitch it to the collective, and then the collective will be able to say, okay, this sounds great. Maybe this part might be a little bit contradictory because, for instance, you want to blow up one of the suns, but it's going to be a challenge because we need to have two suns in this universe. So if you're going to blow up one of the suns, maybe it has to happen really, really like in the distant future, so that it doesn't affect all the stories that came before. So it's more of a figuring out how to make it work rather than having rules about what you can and cannot do. It's more about just, okay, well, yes, let's see how we can make this work. Maybe by shifting the timeline, or by having this set on a different place, or tweaking things here and there so that you as the individual writer can still have your vision, but it works in the world in such a way that it's not going to negatively affect anybody else's story. Yeah, because I mean, if you've created something that, yeah, I mean, if we, for instance, we have a planet that at some point is destroyed, and that, that's part of the timeline. So it might be challenging if you want to set a story on that planet after it's been destroyed. It's not impossible. People have done it, but you would have to make adjustments to make it make sense. So that's been a really interesting process, just kind of figuring out how to do that, how to navigate things. But I've also found it to be really inspiring because you get so many ideas from other people's work. I mean, in this novella alone, there are so many things that wouldn't be in the story if it weren't for somebody else's story. For instance, the shack that Shadari lives in, that came from somebody else's story. I didn't invent that.
Wow.
Yeah, there are plenty of things. There's the different, how the sound is captured and stored. Again, that was, somebody else came up with an idea like, okay, I think maybe this would make sense. And then we discuss it, we brainstorm it, and, it finds its way into a story. And then, for instance, I created the Mahumahadi for another story, not even this one, a story I wrote before this one. But now you'll find the Mahumahadi in other stories. So yeah, that's kind of how it works. We feed off each other, and it becomes, in many ways, like a real world, like real life, in the sense that I can borrow anything from real life because it's already there. So if something already exists, you can incorporate it. And yeah, that's quite fun to play with. And you get to see people take things in all kinds of directions that you wouldn't have thought of. You might have invented something for a very specific purpose in your story, and then someone else is inspired by that, and they want to take it in a completely different direction, where they've envisioned, okay, 20 years down the line, this organization is completely different. It now operates, maybe they were heroes before, now they're villains. And you have to go, oh, wow, okay, I'd never even thought about that. But it works for the other story. So it's, yeah, it's a fun process. It's a challenging process, I think, because we are so used to working in isolation as writers. And I think sometimes you kind of have to get over yourself a little bit, where it's like, I think sometimes we want to be precious about things. I mean, I know that I definitely have had experiences where I felt like, oh, but that's my thing. I don't want you to do that. You're messing it up. But then actually you kind of have to let go and let things develop and grow, and yeah, and they actually become really exciting and interesting once you can do that. But yeah, there's definitely a process of kind of release, as a creator, just kind of being able to understand that we are building a bigger vision, and everything that you add to this vision then becomes part of the wider world, and now yeah, kind of belongs to everyone in a way that might not be the case if it was just um, an individual imaginary world.
Mm.
Yeah.
I feel like it adds a nice dynamic to a writer's life because, like you say, we live such solitary lives, besides juggling other stuff. So being able to co-create these worlds and stories with other authors just brings um, you into contact with like another community rather than you just being in this thing alone.
Mm.
So one thing that I'm curious about, because you had mentioned the process of writing a story to this universe where the collective gives like certain suggestions. So I'm just curious about the development of your novella from beginning to the end in terms of you craft wise and then having to deal with the collective. But also because I was very fascinated with the concept of sound itself, just how you develop that throughout the novella. I mean, I think it was like in the beginning scene where Shadari is visiting a healer and they talk about the way that she's misusing the sound message, sound magic. And even just the phrasing, I think those are phrasing like pockets of silence and how she steals like slivers of sound and how they're excavators who excavate sounds and characters who have mother given sounds. I just didn't know that you could come up with a story that could play around with sound and silence in a way as if like you could touch them. So can you kind of like break down this magic system of this sound and also how the story originated to you and how you developed it to the end?
Mm. All right. Maybe let me start with the sound system. Um, it's quite the thing that's really interesting about it is that there's so many things that we have not yet cemented. And I'm sure as more stories come up, some of these questions will be answered.
Mm,
But essentially, the way that we've envisioned it is that sound is, it's almost, it's kind of like a, a life force almost. So you have, when we say mother sound, which is the title of the first anthology, we're talking about sort of the divine sound that started everything. So that would be the equivalent of the Big Bang, but it's a sound. It's like the initial sound that set off the creation of the universe.
mm,
Um, and the mother is sort of the deity that created this universe. And so sound has so many different connotations. It's divine. It represents power. Um, the fact that magic is conducted using sound. Um, that means that it's almost like it's like energy, I guess.
mm.
I wish I was a physicist so I could kind of explain this in a more.
You're doing perfect.
Thank you. But yeah, kind of like it's energy in various forms. So that can be whether you consider that spiritual energy, divine energy, or whether, more physical energy that can be used to power a ship, for instance, or can be used in the way that you would use a battery. I mean, we have characters that capture sound from sound storms. They go out and they harvest sound during storms. So yeah, it's very much, we envisioned it as something that is almost tangible. People relate to it as if it's tangible, but also as if it's, maybe the closest comparison would be something like electricity, but also something like the soul. So it's all encompassing, I guess I would say.
Mm,
And so the magic system differs depending on where you are, which group of people, which community it is. Different communities might practice their sound magic in different ways. But the idea is that everyone has um, a sound aura, which is kind of like their soul, and that can kind of influence, I guess, how they show up in the world. But that being said, there's also people, there are practitioners of sound magic who, for whom it's a profession, you know, in the same way that someone would be an engineer or a doctor. You would have, we call them madiregi, which is essentially somebody who practices magic as a profession. This is what they do for a living, and it's almost technical in that sense. And then you have an urogi, who is a healer, who uses sound magic as medicine. So there are all kinds of different ways in which sound magic can be used or misused, depending on the situation. And we have a lot of room for playing around with that in terms of what exactly can be done, how it can be done. There are no real restrictions in that sense. So you'll find that different stories represented a little bit differently. So with that in mind, when I was writing this story, I really wanted to capture the spiritual aspect of it more than anything else. I had written a short story with a character she's a really minor character in this novella, but in the short story, she's the main character. And Shaddari is actually a minor character in that story. But when I wrote that story, I was really kind of captivated by Shaddari, and I really wanted to tell her story. And so I decided to write a story with her as the protagonist. And I was also grieving. I had lost my father not too long before this, and then sort of subsequently, somewhere in the process of writing The Way of Bach, then I lost someone else very close to me. And so I was just kind of in the process of reeling from grief, really, and wanting to find a way to express it, but I wanted it to be in a positive way. I didn't want to write something that was depressing and sad. I wanted to write something that was hopeful and uplifting, and that would bring peace, I guess, to me, but also to anyone who read it. And yeah, so I had all these things in mind about what I wanted to do and what I wanted to capture, but I was really struggling with it just because of where I was emotionally. And so it was a very long process of kind of getting the story to be where I needed it to be. Yeah, mainly because I had to get there first myself before I could get the story there. But I knew, I had it in the back of my mind that this is what I wanted to capture. I want to tell a story about grief, about how difficult it is to cope with grief, about the ways in which we try to run away and escape from grief, and how sound can be used as a coping mechanism, the same way that we use substances or various forms of consumption, various distractions. Yeah, and what would that look like in a world like this, in a world where people have magic and sound is so vital and so important? What would it look like, first of all, to be haunted in that kind of world? And so I kind of envisioned that this character would be haunted by the echoes of the people that she had lost. So rather than seeing ghosts, she would hear their echoes and kind of feel them constantly following her around. And so everything she does is trying to banish those echoes, trying to get rid of those sounds by immersing herself in other sounds. Yeah, so that was, these were different things that I was trying to play with, and also listening to music a lot and trying to kind of tap into, okay, what am I feeling? What does the sound actually evoke in me? and what does that feel like physically, and how can I sort of take that and interpret it for this story and for this world. Like, what would it feel like if she was listening to a sound that's wrong, you know, that's meant to be for something, but she's using it in the wrong way. How might that affect her body? And yeah, what would that look like? What would it feel like? And then, yeah, trying to figure out how to make that make sense on the page, you know, because it once you get it in your head, it can make sense in your head, but then making it make sense to another person is another story. And yeah, that's when the collective really came in. You know, I mean, they were very helpful. They're always very helpful. That's kind of one of the best things about being in a collective, is that you always have that sounding board, and you have that support system that can help you see through your own blind spots, you know, things that you're not thinking about. And that can also just, you know, when you're worried and thinking, oh gosh, this is really bad, you know, you have people that can say, oh no, actually this makes sense, this works. So that was really helpful. That was really, really vital, because I almost gave up on the story a number of times. And so it was wonderful to have people just kind of encourage me and yeah, and believe that I could do it and believe in the story. So yeah, that was the process. It was a long a long process, but I think it worked out. And then the artwork also really helped, because there's a certain kind of, I don't know, it's magical really when you write something and then someone can illustrate it and represent what you're trying to say. That feels really, that's a very powerful thing. And it's one of the things that I also really love and appreciate about the collective, is that we have so many different representations of this world that we've created. Yeah, and all of them they just inspire you more and more and more, and help you get to that next step. I don't know if I answered the question. I feel like I went.
You did. You actually even eventually answered like the next question that I had, which was regarding Shad Dari's character, because I found her very complex and she was dealing with this whole grief. And even the way that she's able to like explain how she misuses like the sound magic, it's exactly like you say, the way people abuse, say, for example, like drugs and alcohol to help them like manage whatever it is that they're dealing with. And I'm quite sorry for the losses that you went through. And I feel that the way that you executed her character was quite exceptional. And as you were talking, I was just remembering particular scenes in the book, which will probably be a little bit of a spoiler if I reveal them, but it also makes sense when she has to actually deal with the consequences of of this abuse of sound that she's been doing from the beginning, that she has to deal with towards the end. That was very, very heartbreaking. So, I mean, we're running out of time. I don't know if there are any questions from the audience before I actually move to the next question. Okay, no questions so far. So my next question is in regards to language and names in your novella, because I know like we were speaking a little bit before this live started and how you came to the construction of certain words in your novella. There's one scene where Shadari is asked like for her name by an Akba, and the way that she pronounces it within those people's culture is considered blasphemy. And there's actually this line that I found very intriguing. It occurred to her that the words of her chosen name might mean something offensive in his tongue. And I have come into conversation with friends from like other African countries, and we'll be like sharing certain words from like our different language, and you'll find similarities because of like the sound of the words. It may not be exactly spelled, in that language, but the sound of it will have the same meaning in that language, or a certain word will be offensive to them. So I was very interested in the way that you handled how conflict arises with the cultures within your novel. And I just wanted you to speak a little bit about that scene and the different people that you have in your novel, in your novella, sorry.
Um, yeah, that's a really good question. That's a really interesting question.
And sorry,
Um,
just to expand, because you had broken it down to me, some of the words that you constructed. So if you can like reference some of the words in your story and how you came about to actually naming them.
mm, okay, well, there were some things that were already kind of existing in the world. Um, Things like, I mean, the names of the planets and things like that. Uh, we had all kind of brainstormed and agreed on ahead of time. And a lot of them come from things like things related to sound. Even the name Sautiverse, comes from the word Sauti, um, which means voice in Swahili. So, we would have people kind of chipping in from their own specific cultural context. So that happens a lot. And then we kind of incorporate that, or we Sautify the words, um, which really means that we kind of developed um, naming conventions for the world. And Stephen was actually very helpful with that, because he's kind of the linguistic brain. Uh, but yeah, sort of understanding that a language has to have certain characteristics to make it a language, and to make it distinct. And so we knew that we needed to have distinct ways of framing words and names to make them Sauti, so that they're not just regular African names. And so what we would do is, because sound is so important and so integral, we would do things like we would have names that echo, names that repeat, um, or names that have, apostrophes that kind of signify that it's almost like two words, but it's pronounced as one word. We would have, you'll find a lot of repeating names. For instance, in the novella, there's names like Fafali, um, which comes from, in my mother tongue of Ewe in Ghana. Fafa means peace. So I just kind of tacked on the li at the end, but you have the fa and the fa for the repetition. And then you have names like the name Shaddari in itself really was just my way of trying to find a bastardized version of her original name, her birth name. And I really wanted it to be the kind of thing that you would do if you were a kid who had run away from home and you're on the spot and you have to figure out what you're going to call yourself, like you haven't thought about it at all. So you're going to pick something that's close enough to your real name that it's easy to remember. It comes top of mind. But also because Shaddari is really intrigued by this Akba species, she immediately kind of latches onto that and wants to imitate them. So, like how you might want to give yourself a name that is similar to someone you admire, a role model or something, but also similar to your own name. So that's kind of what she was trying to do in her youth and in her ignorance, really. And what happens is that she ends up really committing a sort of uh, a major cultural faux pas, because she doesn't know enough about this other culture to actually do something like that. And it turns out that it's quite offensive what she's done. She doesn't realize that it's offensive. She doesn't mean to offend, but simply because she doesn't know enough about the culture, um, she ends up making this mistake. And I wanted to reflect that as part of the possible tensions that can come up between different species. especially in the context of sound, because this is a non-human species. You know, they're sentient, they're intelligent, they interact with human beings, but they're very much other, and they have their own way of doing things, they have their own beliefs, and also they have their own sound magic and their own way of communicating, and they cannot communicate with humans in their own language. It's physically impossible for humans to contain their sounds. So essentially, a human being you would just get sick and possibly die if they try to speak to you in their own language. And so they use sign language. That's how they communicate with humans. And so that also enhances the level of blasphemy of what she's done by taking one of their names, because she's reduced it to something completely different and alien from what it's supposed to be. And not only that, she's even picked words that should not be used to name someone. You know, it's kind of that thing that we do sometimes when you go to a foreign country and you want to get a tattoo in that language, and then somebody will tell you later on, actually no, but you think your tattoo means something great, like warrior spirit or whatever. Meanwhile, it means trash or something, you know. And it's just ignorance, really. That kind of maybe you looked it up online and the website said that this means warrior spirit, but it really doesn't. So it's that kind of thing, that kind of these cultural things that happen, where you inadvertently offend someone just because you don't know any better. And I wanted to capture that. I just wanted to kind of capture these normal things that happen when different people come together. But I also wanted to capture a little bit of how Shatari moves through the world, because she is a little bit reckless. And after she goes through this tragedy, she becomes even more reckless. She becomes almost compulsively reckless, and insisting on keeping this name even after she discovers the truth of what it means is kind of an indication of how she's just kind of saying a big F you to the world. Yeah, so these were all things that I was kind of hoping would come through in the story. Oh, you're muted.
So sorry about that. I'm just in awe at the different threads that you've developed in your book and the amount of things that you were juggling. Like even just the world building is so exceptional. The different characters you were able to add and the depth that you gave to the characters, like the Akbar, like you say, if humans listen to them, it'll be too much to bear. And so they use sign language. It honestly feels like you've captured a novel within the novella itself. So yeah, because we're also running out of time, I will just also say if anyone has any questions, please feel free to load up your questions and I can ask Cheryl. It's so nice like picking at your brain. I feel like I'm in a class learning about world building. I'm like, okay. Um, so this will probably be one of two, three last questions. Because you had mentioned as you were trying to unpack this grief onto the page, but with something of a hopeful tone. I'm curious on how long it took to write the novella, and also, yes, it's set in Sautiverse, but was there any other research that you did whilst writing this book?
Okay, in terms of how long it took, it's a bit hard to say because I stopped writing it for a while. I think I started almost immediately after I had finished the first story. So that would have been 2 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, that's when I first started writing it. And then I got to a point where I just couldn't. I worked on it for a couple of months and then I had to stop. So I stopped for a while, put it aside for a few months, came back to it, put it aside again. So, I mean, all in all, I would say it took me, yeah, maybe almost a year before I could actually
Wow.
finish it,
Oh
which
my,
is very, very long for me. But yeah, it was because I had to keep stopping and starting, and
yeah.
yeah, I was having a hard time with it, so it took me a while. Um, and then in terms of, I'm so sorry, I forgot what was the other
Yes,
question?
I'm sorry, I ask a million of questions. What kind of research did you do besides the story Bible that's provided to you?
Um, well, I mean, I have to admit, I'm very, very lazy about research. Um, I really hate doing research. So, and typically what I do is I try as much as possible to just make things up as much as I can so I don't have to do research. But I did do a lot of, I mean, I don't know if it's really, it wasn't intentional research, let me put it that way. But I did read a lot of, or I did focus a lot on uh, Buddhist practice and Buddhist teachings.
Mhm.
And that was something that I was also trying to, because I wanted it to be, I wanted to focus kind of on the spiritual angle, and because I wanted the tone of the book to be hopeful. So I drew a lot from that. I drew a lot from Buddhist texts and, yeah, just kind of Buddhist principles around suffering and around navigating pain and, yeah, and things like that. So in particular, the one book that was really helpful to me was called The Wisdom of No Escape by Pema Chodron. Yeah, I would say that's probably the, outside of the Sautiverse story Bible and Mother Sound,
Mhm.
and just picking the brains of my fellow Sautiverse collective members. Yeah,
Mhm.
that was the main thing that kind of inspired a lot of the book. But yeah, I'm terrible with research. I'm lazy. I'm so lazy. It's embarrassing actually how lazy I am.
I'm surprised because your words are so always rich in descriptions, characterization, and the world building details. Um, and I always think that you've done like immense research, or your brain is just actually your brain is an encyclopedia. Because I think what slows me down is usually research, and I wish I could have a brain that could do that.
I actually think that's really admirable to be able to do research because it really, you can see it, um, you can really see it when a writer has taken the time and the trouble to go deep into a subject. And I mean, I'll do a basic search sometimes. There might be something that I want to know, just a very um, like sometimes I'll look up specific things from my own culture.
Mhm.
If my mom is not immediately on hand, or there isn't someone I can ask, I'm just like, let me just Google it quickly. So I'll do that. I'll do like basic desktop research. But yeah, it's been a very, very long time since I've done extensive um, research that actually takes time, that takes more than a few minutes.
It does. Right. Okay, so we have one more reading left and just one question left, and we'll close this off. Can you give us another reading from your novella?
Absolutely. All right. Um, okay, this is going to be quite a short one. And it kind of speaks to what we just discussed about language and names.
Mhm.
It was said that Akpa names bound their bearers' souls and determined their fate, a spiritual contract between the mother and her children. Shadari would learn, shortly after landing on Orinorin, that in the Akpa tongue, Shad meant insatiable greed, and Dari was something like a walking shadow, a person who had no soul, a ghost. An inauspicious name, but she wore it like a talisman. It was the only thing other than running away that she had ever chosen for herself. Before it, life had been something that happened to her, barely requiring her participation, let alone her permission. There was much to learn about excavating sound fragments. Shaddari had always known that sounds from all over the universe found their way to the unlikeliest places, carried in travelers' songs, physical artifacts, planetary debris, spells that lived in the bones of those who had cast or received them, satellite transmissions, dying whales locked in shipwrecks, prayers bound in temple ruins. Yet she had never imagined that the planets gobbled sound and hoarded it in tree roots, soil, and mountain crevices, in water so deep no human could bear the pressure. She learned that sounds imbued with powerful emotion and matter-bending will lingered like echoes in the fabric of life, and that the right kind of magic could bring those sounds back, as loud as the day they were made. She was thrilled to discover that the use of innate magic, echo magic for the Ikukwe-born recruits like her, was banned during excavation jobs. Her home was on Orunarin now, and her loyalty was to Zezefeni. She put her voice signature on contract upon contract, stating as much. Contracts to ensure compliance with South 3 regulations, contracts to prevent her from selling company secrets, contracts binding her to regular spiritual support from orange-robed Susununya teachers, placed her quote uncomfortable with her techniques by the Zefeni Council. And them a piece of her heritage with each contract, praying to the mother that this treachery would be enough to turn the ghost echoes away. Why would they linger when she was no longer one of them? Why not go home where they would be embraced? And yet the echoes remained, long after Shadadar ceased to exist, as though punishing her new incarnation was more important than finding peace in the hereafter. Thankfully, Orunarin was full of dangerous, creative ways to silence one's demons. With her lucrative new job, Shaddari could afford to try them all.
Wow, thank you so much. Just like hearing you read that, it sounded like very poetic. I don't know how you're able to stretch your stamina through every single work and still be able to write with such beauty. Um, so as a last thing, I don't know, there's probably something that I may have missed in terms of asking or emphasizing on. Is there something that you want to say to the audience regarding Songs for the Shadows?
Well, it's available to buy.
Yes.
So please go to the Athos Arts website and check it out. It's available in print, in ebook, and also in audiobook, narrated by me. So you get to hear me read my own story, which is pretty cool. Yeah, so if you want to get it, please do. Mother Sound is also available to buy. It's published by Android Press, so you can get it from the Android Press website or the usual places, Amazon and so on. And there's also an audiobook of that. So yeah, I think treat yourself to that because it's really nice to hear, considering that this is a universe that's built on sound. I think it's really nice to hear the audiobooks and hear the stories being read to you. Yeah, and in addition to this, I mean, there's so many upcoming Sauti stories in the works. So take a look at the Sauti website, sauti.com, where you can find out more about the project, more about what stories have been published so far, what's been nominated for awards. You can read reviews. You can look at the story Bible and the artwork. And you can learn more about upcoming projects, one of which is the next Sauti anthology called Sauti Terrors, which will be dark fantasy and horror. So we are very excited about that. And there are also other Sauti novellas and Sauti novels that will be coming out. So yeah, there's more to come, lots and lots more to come. And we hope that this will grow to, include as many wonderful, talented writers and artists as possible. So yeah, please go and check out all these different websites and see what we are up to.
Thank you. Also, to add to that, what are you working on? What is coming next for you that you can share?
Ooh, uh, what is coming next for me? I don't
Or
know.
or maybe something that you're writing that you're planning.
Well, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but anyway.
If you can't, it's
um,
fine.
no, I think it's okay. It's general enough. But yes, I'm working on young adult and romantasy novels. So I'm not sure which will make it out into the world first, but yeah, you can either look forward to a sort of dystopian YA story or a more light-hearted, fun, frivolous, highly fashionable romantasy with lots of um, steamy scenes and high fashion.
Like you
A
can
lot.
literally write anything.
Well, I try.
Yeah. And
um, but also, if you haven't already, do pick up a copy of Tlotlo's book Womb City because it is extraordinary. And I had the honor of reading it way back when. So I'm very very excited that it's out there in the world. Yeah, please read it. Please get a copy for yourself. Get copies for your friends. It's a treasure, and it's really really exciting to see Botswana fiction out there in the world. I hope to see more.
thank you so much. Bless you. Um, I know since the fashion book that you're talking about, I was reading it and I'm like, oh my gosh, how is Cheryl able to just keep on writing amazing works like this? It's such a challenge. So looking forward to whenever that comes out. Um, right. So where can readers find you? Social media, website, where can we find you?
Yes, you can find me on my website, though I think a more direct way would be either Instagram or Facebook. Um, Facebook, it's just my name, Cheryl Ntumy. Instagram, my handle is litchickbw, because, you know, I grew up in Botswana, so BW for Botswana.
Yeah.
um, yeah, so you can check out, I usually post, you know, announcements or whatever is coming up there. Oh, and I also wanted to say there are also a lot of really, really wonderful books published by Athos Arts. If you go to the Athos Arts website, you'll get to see everything that's available um, and that's out. There are also a lot of conversations with different authors on the Athos Arts YouTube channel. So please check out all of those. And yeah, you will be missing out if you don't. So do yourself a favor and go and have a look at everything that's on offer.
Right. Thank you so much for that. And thank you everyone who came to watch us and listen to us talk. Sure, it was very nice to just step into your brain and see the whole process. You gave such great answers. It just got me thinking a lot, like my writer brain on. So thank you so much. And I hope that more people are able to read your works and the Saltyverse and every author connected to this. Right. Thank you and bye. Have a good day.
Thank you so much, Tlotlo. Thank you everyone for coming.
I think we stay on.